Hi, good morning. Well, it's good to be with you. And, we have 4 adult children. And sometimes when I tell them, I talk to people about parenting, some of them have sort of a little bit of a skeptical look, like, you're talking to people. Well, so as Marty and I often tell people, we're not parenting experts, right? We're not even trained counselors or anything like that. We're just ordinary parents who have raised 4 children to adulthood, hopefully responsible adulthood, ages 32 down to 23. And, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, right? We wouldn't trade it for anything. There's some highs and some lows. Now my 23-year-old, who's sort of the theologian among my children, would call me up and ask me, he would say, "Dad, I have 3 minutes. Can you explain to me what reformed means?" Okay, well, or he would say, "Dad, what does Romans 7 mean?" The person there, that's what sort of theologians debate. And so he's a member of David Platt's church, McLean Bible Church up in Arlington, Virginia. And he's working there with The Rock, which is a middle school ministry. And so he's going on their winter camp next weekend. And so I just love that, to have, sort of a counterpart, somebody in the family I can, other than my wife, I can talk, shop with. And don't think that he just accepts everything I say, right? I mean, he's sort of pushing back, and he, sometimes have to sort of really come up with all the evidence before he says, "Well, yeah, maybe you're right," kind of thing, and I wouldn't have it any other way. So that's just the joy of having children. Marnie and I have been married for 36 years. She's Canadian from Toronto. I'm from Vienna, Austria originally. I came to the States in '85. That's 40 years ago. I'm, grateful that God has led me, and I'll give my testimony during the service. So I think we would all agree that parenting is a wonderful God-given privilege. We have the opportunity to reproduce ourselves, to create, as the Bible says in Genesis 1, image bearers who can, once saved in particular, reflect God's glory, spread the good news of salvation in Jesus Christ to the ends of the earth. And so when you think of it from God's mission, to raise children, right, especially to raise disciples for Christ, it's just a wonderful part of God's mission. And I feel like sometimes in church and we don't talk enough, and we don't equip parents enough about, just understanding the connection between mission and parenting and discipleship. The Bible doesn't provide us with sort of a parenting manual as such, but it is full of relevant principles for parenting. And Marty and I, toward the end of our immediate parenting journey, parenting is really never done, right? But when sort of our last one left the nest a few years back, we thought this would be a good time to reflect on what we'd learned parenting our children, and things that we might want to tell them and equip them so that they could, maybe have a bit of a framework for how to parent, something that we didn't necessarily have when we started out, because we both come from non-Christian homes. And so we have 2 older daughters. They're both mothers now, and it's just so neat to see them. They're not little girls anymore, being mothers and caring for their little ones. And so Marnie and I got away on sort of a mini retreat out in Durham, there at the Arrowhead Inn, and we, one evening we said, okay, let's just think about some of the things we learned. And so literally we sort of scribbled on a napkin, and by the time we're done, we had about like 28 or 32 different things, sort of random things that we learned. Like, one of the important things that help your children to make good decisions, right? Obviously, ultimately, who to marry, what vocation to choose, and so forth. So instilling in them sound principles of decision making was just one of the 28 things there. And so, rather than write a book about, 28 things that parents need to know, that's a little unwieldy, even though I've seen books like that. We tried to sort of group it in categories. And in the end, we came up with 3 categories, 3 R's. No, not writing, reading, and arithmetic, but they don't, by the way, when you think about it, only one of those 3 starts with an R, right? But realism, relationship, and responsibility. In other words, we need to be realistic about parenting. Sometimes we nurse this romantic fantasy, right, of children being perfect and innocent and sweet and cute and all of that, and they are that, right? But the Bible tells us that we all have sinned, fall short of the glory of God, and so rather than sort of starting out with this romantic fantasy, right, and have a sort of a rude awakening, right, a few weeks into, if it takes that long, your parenting journey, you might as well start out with the understanding that children are sinners, right? Sometimes even I, as a young parent, I was shocked when one of my children disobeyed, and then eventually I realized, what am I thinking, right? Of course they're going to disobey because, they're sinners, and so we have to sort of settle into this hopeful realism, right? So that would be the first R, and then the second R would be that of relationship. For me, I would sometimes, truth told, I would just look at parenting more like a task, that check off on my list. I would just go to work and I come home, and then I do parenting from like 5 to 8 kind of thing, and then I still have the rest of the evening left. Now, my wife never approached parenting that way because he realized it was a 24/7 proposition, right? And so I gradually realized it's just not going to work that way. And so for me, I had a pretty steep learning curve when it came to be a parent and a father. So, to look at parenting as this growing relationship with your child, so you need to keep the lines of communication open, even when they maybe hit the teenage years, and you need to spend time with them. My wife would stay up late with one of my daughters, if there's something at school that happened, and there's a lot of cliquishness and, whatever, the social groups and so forth. And so, I remember going on vacation, and we were down in Florida, and by the pool there, I read Paul Tripp's book on parenting teens. What is it called? Age of Opportunity. And, I realized my wife was already doing all those things, which is why I was reading the book and not her, But for me, I'm a little bit more like cerebral. And so for me, if I read it, right, if I understand it, if I commit myself to it, I can sort of act it out. But it doesn't come quite as natural as maybe the father instinct is not quite as strong as the mother instinct. I don't know. And then thirdly, the idea of being responsible as a parent. And I don't necessarily mean responsible as opposed to irresponsible, but more the idea that you want to follow through, right? I think sometimes we basically release our children, we think we're done when we're really not done, And so I think what we found is not only in high school, but even in college, right? We're still very close to our children, and they would often call us or ask us for input. Gradually the relationship changes, right? It becomes more of a friendship, perhaps. And so our children still need us, right? I mean, we have a son in his late 20s, and he's not married, and we talk to him on the phone almost every day, because, and again, there's differences. I would talk to him about certain topics, like, his work and whatever, just, more business-related things, and Marnie would talk more about relationships and so forth. So it's funny, he knows just who to call, right? With a given issue, with either her phone rings or my phone rings, and we enjoy just having that continuing relationship as parents. So being realistic, being relational, and responsible. is sort of a framework. And when we wrote our books, and we wrote, just if you see it on the book table, we wrote this one first. It's a little bit thicker. That's Equipping for Life. And then people said, hey, can you give it to us a little bit shorter? And so we did the Parenting Essentials. We just recorded this as an audiobook, by the way, because people, again, told us, hey, you know, that's how we read. We don't read. We just listen to audiobooks. So we just finished recording that. It'll still be a few months before that'll be out. So anyway, we had in mind the whole parenting journey. You know, there's books written about parenting toddlers or, you know, little ones, and then, you know, like I said, parenting teenagers. But what we wanted is we wanted to give people a framework for the whole parenting journey, basically raising children to be, you know, mature, responsible adults. And, you know, in our case, we have them literally, you know, in 4 major urban centers, you know, across the United States, and, you know, where they can thrive, where they can flourish. You know, my Austrian mother is a little bit old-fashioned. You know, she deplores the fact that they're so spread out, you know, and obviously, you try to lock them up, right, in their house if you could, so you have them around, but that's just not God's will, we're convinced. And so it's nice to have them, right, to make the most of the opportunity while you have them, and to equip them, and then to send them out. That's similar to what Jesus did with his followers, you know, so the training is important, but then they have their own mission. And so, you know, one of my parents was a little more sort of possessive and protective, and so I'm a strong believer in releasing your children, you know, to find their own way and their own place in this world. So we're going to have opportunity for Q&A in just a few minutes. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to give you a very brief digest of some of the highlights from the books, and if you're interested, you know, you can pick up a copy later. But so I'll just say a word each about realism, relationship, and responsibility, and then we'll open it up for questions and comments. When it comes to realism, it's probably my favorite part of the book. And we have 3 chapters on each. We have a chapter each on realism related to parents. You know, what do we want to understand about ourselves? And I think that's important because often we think parenting is just about the children, right? To keep them in line and to discipline them and so forth. But I think it's good to start with the parents because, after all, you know, we're the parents. And sometimes parenting problems are not primarily because of the children. It's because of parents. Either they're too busy or they're, you know, we're too selfish. Or maybe we can't agree on how to parent. You know, I've had a friend who had such serious and continual conflicts with his wife about how to parent their daughter that they ended up getting a divorce because it was just, whatever reason, they just couldn't agree. And it was just a source of constant conflict. For some of us, we're in sort of a maintenance mode. You know, we just get into this routine of dropping the children off at school or whatever, you know, sports or, you know, but we're sort of just doing the best we can on a daily basis. But the fact is maybe we don't have sort of a clear end goal in mind. You know, and people tell us it's always good to sort of have to know what your purpose is as parents. So being realistic about our own, not just our sinfulness, right, that we may lose our temper or we will lose our temper at times, but also that we have certain limitations. I remember that when I years ago read James Dobson's book, What Wives Wish Husbands Knew About Women, I was amazed to find that the number one thing that wives wish husbands knew about them is that they get tired, right? When they have several children to care for all day long. I don't know what I was thinking, right? But so I guess I was thinking something more serious, you know, and again, that's probably not the right way of putting it, you know, but it's just a matter of them needing a break, right? So needing their husband to support them, to give them that break or to partner with them, maybe even during the day, not even just sort of wait, I had a colleague, and I thought that was great. He would sort of check in occasionally, and when I'd go out for lunch with him, on the way to the restaurant in the car, he would just call home and say, hey, how are things going? Well, Johnny was misbehaving again. Let me talk to Johnny for a minute, and I think his wife loved that, right? She was not sort of left, right, alone at home, just fending for herself for whatever 8 long hours, but he would sort of partner with her and support her all day long in that way. Secondly, not just being realistic about us as parents, but also being realistic about our children. I already talked about their sinfulness. Now, total depravity, right, doesn't mean that they're always going to be bad or they can't do anything good, right? It just means they cannot save themselves. They cannot ultimately sort of reform themselves, redeem themselves. So they need, right, ultimately the Holy Spirit, like we all do, as the only person or agent that can transform them from within, right? They can change their hearts, because we all have a heart that's sort of bent toward selfishness and self, right? Give an example from our own lives. My daughter, the younger one, she already has 2 children. A girl, an older girl who's 3, and then a boy who's 10 months old. And so she's pregnant again with her 3rd child, and so they just. So they asked the girl, the older one, so what would you like? Would you like the mom to have a boy or a girl? And she said, well, without hesitation, I want a girl because I already have a brother, I thought that was pretty clever, for somebody of that age. And so sure enough, they just found out 2 days ago that she's pregnant with a girl, right? And so immediately some people in the family responded, well, look, Ellie, right, the daughter got her wish, right? She got the little sister she wanted. And I was sort of hesitant to say that, because I don't want her to think life always revolves around her and she's always going to get her way, right? And so there are subtle ways as parents we can sort of be understated about that, right? To not feed into the narcissism, that life revolves around them, because they will soon enough find out it doesn't. And so we don't want to create this illusion in our family, that sort of we gravitate toward them. It's easy to do because you just love them so much, right? You want them so much to be happy and fulfilled. But I think that's where we need to sort of understand what the Bible teaches about our inner disposition, sort of gravitating towards self. Yeah, a lot more that could be said, and we see a little more in the book. And then thirdly, probably my favorite chapter in the book is chapter 3. It's called "I'm Overwhelmed," right? And it's the fact that not only are we sinners parenting sinful children, but also the world is not always our ally when it comes to parenting, right? And there's the culture is just in terrible shape right now, and getting worse. Mothers often, face unrealistic expectations. I just read an article actually I now get the Wall Street Journal for free because one of the schools I'm teaching at. And so I read there's this new trend for mothers to have to be absolutely perfect. I mean, maybe it was always that way in certain circles, but now it seems like it's actually a thing that mothers sort of, there's a lot of peer pressure, that they're dressed, like super well, and their hair is perfect and everything. And then, and I could just see that would be crushing, to sort of live up to that utopia. It's almost like, you have all day long to just take care of your own, appearance and so forth. There's many who work to try to nurture their children, but like I mentioned, there's fatigue, maybe in many cases lack of support from the husband as well. We homeschooled our children for almost their entire, growing up years. But often it was entirely the mother doing all the homeschooling, on top of everything else. And the husband was just not at all involved. So that's obviously very sad. For men, maybe that we're expected to work long hours, to travel a lot, and so maybe even on the weekends. So again, it puts a strain on the family. children nowadays, I mean, I'm sure it's a lot harder to be a teenager now than it ever has been, you know, with all the gadgets and the social media and all the challenges that come, that sort of, you know, the addiction, you know, that there's a lot of legislation now, starting in Australia of all places, right, that ban, you know, what are children under 14 from any social media or screens and so forth, because people have seen the addictive nature of much of that. And so it's hard for teenagers to develop a healthy self-esteem and to just to be disciplined, to be productive, to stay focused on you know, preparing for their vocation and so forth. So I have here something on how to discipline, because that's a question we often get asked. So I'm going to just maybe tell you 7 things we talk about in the book without elaborating a whole lot, because most of them honestly are common sense. And you know, a lot of the principles are in the book of Proverbs. You know, if you look there, that's just a gold mine for discipline. So discipline, number 1, should be consistent and predictable. You know, I remember my oldest daughter would often try early on, you know, but Dad, I didn't realize, I didn't know, you know, and so I would make sure as a dad, I repeated things, you know, multiple times ahead of time. If you do this, this will happen, right? To render her without excuse, right? She could not legitimately say, but I didn't know this would happen, right? To be predictable and consistent, of course. Discipline should be age appropriate, right? It changes over time dramatically, you know, so initially, you know, it may involve just you know, just some form of spanking, but later on, it'd be more a matter of reasoning or some other consequences, maybe loss of privileges and so forth. Thirdly, discipline should be child-specific. We had, you know, our first child was sort of more on the rebellious side. The second one was more the compliant side. And so we quickly learned, you know, one size doesn't fit all when it comes to parenting. You know, our second one, you just looked at her and she burst out crying, you know. So you didn't have to, you know, resort to any drastic disciplinary measures for her. But for the rebellious one, you know, it was a little harder to get your point across. So be child-specific. Another one, discipline should be fair and just. You know, that the punishment should fit the crime. As an inexperienced dad, I would sort of go way over the top initially, right? And I would basically mete out those very drastic, you know, sanctions, and then I'd have to sort of pull back because it was clear that, you know, it was not as serious an offense that it warranted, you know, what I meted out there. So to be just, be reasonable. Fifth, discipline should be done in love, not anger. I mean, that's obvious. But sometimes you really take it personal, maybe, you know, rebelliousness. I would say also there's a difference between rebelliousness and whatever, just, I don't want to say ignorance, but sort of a lesser, you know, heart disposition. And so I think especially if there's a rebelliousness, we definitely want to flag that, because that's not okay to whatever, you know, disobey out of disrespect or. Then sixthly, discipline should be future-oriented and forward-looking. In other words, not necessarily belabor, you know, how terrible it was what our child did, but to basically just, deal with it and then move on, you know. And then seventh, to focus on the relationship, you know, to understand this is, our people are not, our children are not sort of objects, you know, they're people. And so we're not so perfect either, right? And so we just want to treat them with kindness and with mercy, just the way we would want to be treated. So, yeah, so then relationships, just a word about relationship. And there, I think you can look at your children as basically investing in them, investing in a relationship which takes time, which, you know, Marnie likes to say that presence is the essence of parenting. You know, presence is the essence of parenting. In other words, you can't parent them if you're not there with them, you know, and so in a nutshell, parenting is just being there for your children, whatever it is they need. And that doesn't change, right? We still, our children are in their 20s, early 30s, right? There's still times when they need us, to be there with them or for them. And so we want to do that as much as possible. And that's often how parenting happens. I love Deuteronomy 6, where it talks about, that famous passage, "Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and might. And then it says, and these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, when you walk by the way, when you lie down, when you rise," and so forth. And so it just reminds me of running errands with my children on a Saturday morning, and we talk about all kinds of things. We might stop somewhere for a milkshake or whatever, and those are the best teaching opportunities sometimes, where you process with them what happened, during the week, that kind of thing. And, some parents are very good at that, and they sort of take time. They almost put in a calendar, so they spend at least, whatever, one quote date with each of their children per week. I never quite was as regimented, but you sort of at least try to be regular in spending time with maybe just one child at a time, where they can be confidential and they sort of can pour out their heart if needed. So there, as maybe a special topic for a relationship, I just want to mention the idea of spiritual warfare, because I do think that it is a thing. The Bible does talk about Satan being a real person, created, a fallen angel. And for mysterious reasons, God has still allowed Satan to have a certain amount of, room now to afflict people, to, and his demons. So I think he has a track record, right, of trying to wreck marriages, of sowing discord, disharmony in families. And so I think we really have to be on the alert when it comes to that, and realize that the cause for problems in the family may not always be internal. Of course, that's part of it, our sin nature, but there may also be, in addition, some external sources. Now, obviously, Satan can work through the world, right, the culture in the world, or he can work in a more direct way. And so I'm just going to read for us Ephesians 6 and then say a word how that applies to parenting, because that's the main passage in the Bible on spiritual warfare, where Paul writes at the end of a letter, "Finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil." So obviously, Paul believes there is a devil, right, and that he can afflict us. And so he's equipping the people in the church there in Ephesus, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood," right? Our enemies, it's not our spouse, it's not our children, it's supernatural fallen powers. Our struggle is rather against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. So see what's going on here. Number one, the whole armor of God, right? Not just part of it, because if you're part of it, you're still vulnerable, right? You need to put it all on. And the idea that you need to put it on before the battle rages, right? And then having done everything, right, to stand firm. So we need to be proactive in that regard, and be ready and be prepared. And then he gives the different pieces of the armor. "Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, put on the breastplate of righteousness, shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith," and that's one of the key pieces of the armor, the shield of faith, "with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one." Trusting God in especially adverse circumstances or conflict. "And take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication." So our battle is not against flesh and blood. We need to put on the whole armor of God, consisting of truth, righteousness, peace, faith, the word of God, and prayer. And so what we do in the book, we basically discuss each of those pieces in the armor. and discuss it in relation to, the family. What does it mean, to put on the belt of truth? Well, you encourage honesty, right, in your children and integrity. And, I'm thinking my son, who's a businessman, just recently told me something that he felt he was a bit of a blind spot, and he realized he needed to be even more scrupulous about, not cutting any corners. And I forget the exact topic, but I was just delighted, right, that he's conscious and the Spirit is sort of at work in his heart, that he's not sort of adopting a situational ethic, whatever he can get away with, right? But that this is the eternal compass, that he wants to be a man of integrity. Earlier, not to cheat on their exams like almost everybody does, and to pursue peace, right? To live by faith. That's another area. I feel like my wife and I, we genuinely try to live by faith, and we bring important decisions to Him, and we pray about it. But do our children always know that we do that, right? And so you may do that in your own privacy, but I think it's good for you to find ways to actually tell your children the reason why we're doing this, because we prayed about it. It may not make sense, right, to some people, but we feel that's what God wants us to do. I made a decision a few years ago to basically walk away from a very lucrative position. And at first my children were saying, "Dad, are you crazy? I mean, why are you doing this? It makes no sense to us." And so I sort of tried to explain it, realizing they probably couldn't understand it at the time. But now, 4 or 5 years later, I think at least a couple of them have come around and say, "Well, Dad, I think I begin to understand now, why you did that." So sort of letting our children in, right? Not keeping it to be a well-kept secret that we're believers. We try to live by faith. Praying together, talking to them about, how we make decisions by faith. And of course, also, ideally, we would model a life steeped in the Word of God and prayer in our family. I guess ideally we would have Bible times with our children. We'd pray together. There's obviously different ways and times and, to do that. So finally, just a word before we have our Q&A time. Responsible parenting, third. And there we talk about three things. We talk about developing character. We talk about education, school choices. And we talk about preparing our children for the mission in life, which is both vocation and finding a spouse. I'm a strong believer in arranged marriages, except none of my children is all that enthused about that. But so we have to be a little more indirect, right, in the way we sort of influence them there. Anyway, so character, right? And that's probably our primary emphasis. What we found is when we send our children to Christian school for a given year, sort of taking a break from homeschooling, that even though that school was nominally Christian and most children or teenagers came from Christian homes, either the children were not necessarily Christians, or if they were not necessarily following Christ very closely, if at all. It seemed like the parents were maybe a little bit in denial when it comes to, how well things were going. I feel like as long as, right, we drop them off at the Christian school, the teachers are going to sort of educate them and they're going to come out. In some ways, I felt like the American dream and just getting ready, right, for taking all those AP classes and getting into a good college and having a good job and so forth, ended up, kind of trumping often character formation. And so we did our best along the way to focus on character with our sons in particular. That involved sports. They had some wonderful coaches, who who did believe in mentoring and discipleship, and I would often analyze the game on the way home, and talk about any teachable moments along the way. That's sort of my favorite thing to do, and my sons enjoyed it as well. And so all in terms of, helping them not prioritize winning or prioritize, just competitiveness, but looking at what lessons could they learn, and my wife did the same with our girls, in different areas. So character is, simple definition, who a person truly is in the heart of hearts. What do they do? What do they do when no one's looking? When they're with their peers or when they're in college. My son was RA at NC State for 3 years, and just unbelievable, unspeakable things happened there in those dorms, and so, yeah, that parents had no idea their children were doing that. They were thinking everything was going great, and maybe they had decent grades, and so they're blissfully, or maybe not blissfully, unaware. And so we don't want to be those kinds of parents. We want to be engaged, right, responsible, and ideally, it's maybe a little bit late, starting when they're already in college. So we want to start while they're still with us. How do we develop character? It doesn't happen just automatically, right? So we have to be intentional, lead by example, and ideally nurture inner spiritual transformation, understanding that external, right, compliance can only go so far. In my case, I was a pretty compliant child. I always had good grades in school. But then for me in college, I really struggled because, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. And so sometimes it's sort of a ticking time bomb, right? And you don't want to be irresponsible in not focusing on character. Character traits would be diligence is a good trait. One of our daughters, she's super diligent, in terms of anything that an assignment or whatever, she does it, just really thoroughly. Self-control, right? So they don't throw a tantrum when they strike out, right, at the baseball game. Like I originally mentioned, honesty, discretion, right? The idea that they have discernment. Can talk to them about the movies they watch, and the friends they choose. Even now, my 23-year-old, he's hanging out with this one guy and has theological conversations. And the guy's just always on the borderline of heresy, right? And I can always predict on any given issue what he's probably going to say. And so I'm sort of keeping a watchful eye on that friendship. He's 23, right? Because I don't want my son to sort of be captivated by, and become a heretic, right? That'd be terrible. So in other words, you can be appropriately protective of your children. Marnie is very protective of our girls in particular. And my daughter would say, well, you're not fair because you let your son do things that you didn't let me do. And I say, well, the risk of sounding sexist, that's because you're a girl, right? And I feel like as a dad, I need to protect you in a way that maybe I don't need to protect my son. I don't know if that makes sense. It doesn't make sense to her, but it makes sense to me, right? So that's why I treat them a little bit differently, But anyway, so that would be an example of that. And in the book, we talked about lots of other things related to character. I mean, I could go on and on for a long time. A hard work ethic, right? They're not lazy. Put them to work, that they do whatever they do with excellence. Again, one of our children, whatever he does, he does with excellence. I'm just so proud of him because somehow it's sort of instilled in him that, you don't put in a half-hearted effort, whether it's playing a violin or playing whatever, pickleball, whatever is that other sport that he's in now. I mean, anything with a ball, he gravitates toward. Good. So education, like I said, we homeschool, but we are not your typical homeschoolers that are sort of ideologically committed to homeschooling. We feel that, it depends on the area, it depends on a couple's giftedness. If you're not called to be a teacher, then maybe you're not doing your children a service to be their primary teacher. It depends on the financial situation, depends on the schools in the area and so forth. So I think we usually took it one year at a time and just looked at what's our best option as a family for this year, even though we typically try to do the same thing for every one of our 4 children, or things would have been just utter chaos. So there's a little bit more in the book on that. And of course, we do tout the advantages of homeschooling. You have more control over the curriculum, get to spend more time with your children. You have more time for field trips and other extracurricular activities and so forth. So, we loved it. And our children, I don't think any of them has any regrets, to this day. The other thing, you can go at their pace, right? We had our first child was a gifted child. She was sort of, at least a year ahead of most of her peers. And so you didn't artificially sort of hold her back, because you sort of had to keep everybody together. And so for her, homeschooling was almost the only option that we could see that she could sort of go at her own pace. Well, vocation, one of my favorite things to do is sort of helping our children to figure out what to do with their lives. Don't have a perfect track record, my wife and I, but one of our daughters is a dietitian, and I recently, I kept a lot of their schoolwork. I came across, just cleaning out some files, an essay she wrote like in middle school about healthy eating. I was thinking, there you go, right? She had an interest in that topic, but obviously I didn't catch on, and that's okay. But sort of she gravitated back to that, and it's a great profession for her to basically what she does is she coaches young mothers in underprivileged areas and countries in the area of childhood nutrition. How to feed their children well. Anyway, and then finally finding a spouse. My wife and I gravitate toward more of a friendship approach. We encouraged our children to just do things in the company of other people, the Christian camp or wherever they were. And then, it's less scarring, if whatever relationship breaks up. The other extreme would be this courtship model. Personally, my wife and I are not advocating it because we feel like it forces children to be serious too soon. And or dating is often, when the children are older, I think it is an option. But it's generally can be too casual and ends up unnecessarily hurting people, especially girls in the process. So in the end, we do feel like God, we're sort of old-fashioned, is sovereign. He providentially will bring 2 people together, at his time. Mercifully, we've experienced that. We met in seminary and had a wonderful courtship and really, to this day, really enjoy being married. So our basic approach to parenting then, so we have at least 10 minutes for Q&A, is to be realistic, to be relational, and to be responsible, being realistic about us as parents, about the children, and about the world in which we live. Relational, we look at parenting as an ongoing relationship. We love our children, and no matter what their age and season in life, and being responsible means that you're never done as a parent, right? You continue to be engaged with them and to just enjoy being there for them when they need you. Parenting can be the best of times, can be the worst of times. And so thankfully we have God's word, right? And we have his Spirit, who are strategic allies in how we parent. And so we're so grateful for our children and our grandchildren, and we know you are too. So hopefully it's been helpful as sort of a big picture framework, and happy for anybody to have a question, comment, on parenting preferably, right? We'll keep it on parenting.
Dr. Gosworth, thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Let's do this. Please ask your question very loud. We'll try not to use the mic for right now.
Sure.
Just please increase your volume, okay?
Thank you.
Keep it to parenting if you can. Let's go. We got a brief amount of time. Let's go. Dan?
Hi, sir. I'm Dan.
Yeah.
Question on your, you said you erred usually on the side of discipline of being too harsh. I think a primary threat is actually, at least for me, my tendencies with my daughters is to be too soft and too gentle. So maybe what are some cues that you look for that your discipline is either too harsh or too soft? And then in line with that, what are the cues that you're looking for of, hey, it is time to change or progress this method of discipline? You know, I'm kind of thinking of very little, the spanking is increasing, and then there's an age at which the spanking decreases. And what are those cues of shifting up,
Yeah.
and what's the cues of shifting down?
Yeah. I mean, we have our granddaughter, Ellie, who's 3.5, and already you can reason with her quite a bit, you know, so I think already that would be preferable, you know, because that way they understand, you know, you're able to explain to them, you know, what the expectations are, and, you know, so I would say in her case, depends on the maturity level, right? But anywhere between whatever 3 and 5, I would say you definitely want to pivot toward more of a, you know, engaging them, talking with them. Problem is it takes time, right? Sometimes we're busy, we don't always have the time, but ideally we would, you know, make the time because it's important for them to understand, you know, why, you know, they fell short and, you know, what the consequences are. In terms of how do we know if we've been too lenient, too hard, I would say just gauging it by their response. You know, if they're sort of ignoring us and, you know, I don't like to be ignored, you know, so I try to get their attention sufficiently that, you know, they realize they have to change, you know, their behavior, you know, in the future. So it's more gauging it by their response to some extent, you know. And like I said, every child is a little bit different. And so it really depends on that particular child. And I try to often operate on the basis of some sort of general theory, you know, and but I quickly realized with parenting, it just doesn't work, you know, it's just so individual, depending on how sensitive they are. So I would say that, yeah, you know, at least by age 5, the transition, and some of that is not necessarily in the Bible, right? There's no other chapter and verse. That's why we sort of have to use some common sense, and I think God has given us the freedom as parents, right, to make those decisions.
Sir, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
Not so loud. What would you say is your biggest concern for like compromise for parents in the culture today? Like, what are the things that we need to be aware of that, yeah, can really affect our children?
Yeah. So what common compromises are being made in the culture by parents today? Yeah. Well, one thing would be that if they send the children to, especially the public school, that they're sort of insufficiently aware of what they might do to their children. And, you know, especially now with the transgender movement and so forth, I think Marnie and I, we used to talk more about marriage, but now most of the requests we're getting is about parenting, because there's a lot of even Christian parents who are really desperate because, say, their child came out as transgender or something, and they're from a good Christian home, you know. So how did that happen? Well, it happened because there was somebody probably in their class, you know, in school that sort of influenced them that way. And then they started to sort of buy into this crazy idea, you know, that you are who you feel you are, who you want to be, regardless of biological gender. So I think maybe, yeah, the idea of even spiritual warfare, right? To realize there's going to be consequences. We can't just sort of hope for the best, you know. If we do that, often what we'll find is, you know, things will not end up working out so well. And it's sort of difficult once that happened, right? Once your child is already sort of change their gender identity, whether just in their mind or they follow through, in more tangible ways, it's sort of hard to go back, and to put the genie back in the bottle, so to speak, So that's why it's so important to sort of be appropriately protective, and preemptive. And that's the one thing that comes to mind maybe immediately. I'm sure there's others too. And Marty, feel free to weigh in if you have any insights there.
I don't know, the only other compromise that comes to mind immediately is the use of technology in appropriate ways.
Okay.
Phones and when to start.
Thank you. Yeah, we usually, when we have like 3 sessions on parenting, Marty usually covers the social media and smartphones portion because she's been very, when our oldest, was a teenager, Facebook started, okay? And so we were very protective and sort of used stalling tactics, delay them, anything to sort of have a little more time with them before sort of they were in a different orbit. So thank you, yeah.
Yeah, I had a question about, you mentioned intentional times with the family and the word and prayer, like family devotion, sounds like. I guess, what would your recommendation there be, of how that looks?
Yeah.
Is that an everyday thing for you guys?
Yeah, I have sort of a special little presentation on that. And I have a friend who's done really well in that area, so I sort of picked his brain on that. But I think it's helpful to gather the family, at least, really as often as possible, typically maybe dinner time or so, to read a portion of scripture, maybe go around the circle and ask people to share and then, pray, that kind of thing. I'm sort of with baseball here, even though I didn't grow up with baseball. If you're batting at around 300, that's pretty good, okay? So we shouldn't aim for a perfect, batting average when it comes to family devotions. It's just more, I think, for dads to accept the responsibility, right? We're the spiritual, right, the leader in the family. And I think definitely, our wife will greatly appreciate a partner with us in that. But again, to be age appropriate, I remember I was going to, read through Romans when our oldest was like 6 years old, and she said, "Dad, Romans is not a book for children, And so saying, okay, maybe I'm a little bit ambitious here, so I sort of waited a few more years before I tackled Romans. Anyway, thank you for raising that. Those are all great questions that if we had more time, right? Social media, compromise, so those are all great things to think about.
Got time for at least one more. Somebody got it?
Yeah, and that'll be the last question, right? So we close around 10:15.
Okay, I got one more question.
Yeah.
So the responsibility that we bear as parents is, obviously more than of their character, but their safety. So in the attempts to avoid a ticking time bomb of a compliant child, what would you suggest are appropriate ways to release said child sooner than maybe normal in some safe-ish way so that you can actually get a feel for their true character? For example, the protective parent, the helicopter parent, never has a real opportunity to observe their parent's character. If their children's character, they never have a chance to actually execute that.
That's a great question. What comes to mind, Marnie, is that, Talia, our second daughter, she requested to go to public school for grades 11 and 12 to be better prepared for college, And at that age, certainly, she's old enough to have input in that decision. And so we allowed her to do that. Well, fortunately, it was a Christian principle. And, it still, I remember, she was friends with people on Twitter in her class. And I mean, the profanity and some of the posts, it was just absolutely terrible. And so we had to sort of navigate that with her. On the one hand, she didn't want to be isolated. but then just to expose yourself to that barrage of, foul language and everything. So that was sort of tough. And fortunately, we trusted her heart. She was as revulsed by that as we were, but she just did that as a way to connect with them. And I think she would probably say, Marnie, don't you think that it helped her make the transition into college just a little more smoothly? Yeah. So that might be something, find ways to get them a little bit out of their comfort zone where their faith is tested, and you can still be there to sort of help them process things. It's less easy for them to just sort of blend in with the environment. She had to make some, stands there in the class, which she would not go along with, that kind of thing.
At the time, she would say that everybody at school was fake. I don't know if that meant something to her, but she doesn't think about that now. That's
Yeah.
what she said then.
Yeah, thank you, Marnie. Good. Good, yeah. Marnie is the real parenting expert in our family. So, she's done most of the parenting, to be, truthful there. So feel free to talk to her more during break and so forth. But thank you so much. I think that's all we have time for, John.
We can thank Dr. Kussenberger.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.